and thanks everyone for joining today. Our topic today is cloud-based PDM and both the security and usability implications. So it will probably be a relatively short presentation because the kind of thing that either you get into excruciating detail or keep it at a somewhat high level. We're going to keep it at a somewhat high level today. But the things I'd like to talk about today, I work with a lot of companies that are trying to move as much of their data off premise as possible. And CAD data is one of those things that can be extremely difficult to work with if it's remote. So I want to talk about the considerations for moving CAD data off premise as a starting point. And despite the difficulties that can entail, the benefits that you can realize from doing that. I'd like to talk then about some of the various options you would have for moving that data off premise and why they might be good or bad. We'll then talk about specifically get into more of the Autodesk products and their cloud solutions, not too much in the detail of those cloud solutions, but more in the context of really how secure are their solutions? What do they do to guarantee that your data stays safe and secure? And then we'll finish up with a very brief overview of specifically the PDM capabilities. When I say PDM, I mean like product data management, typically the CAD file management, the capabilities of one of Autodesk's newer solutions called Upchain. And it actually said, please feel free to ask questions via the question pane at any time. I'll do my best to address those. If it's a question that would fit in context of what I'm talking about when I see it, I'll try to address it as I go. Otherwise, I'll address the questions toward the end. So let's talk about off-premise CAD data and things to consider about this data. Because a lot of times an IT or an IS department will be tasked with moving all the data off premise or, get the stuff off servers. We don't want to have servers on site. And, depending on the staff responsible for getting this data off premise, if they don't have any experience with CAD or CAD data and how it works, and especially if you're using parametric CAD software like Autodesk Inventor, it's different from just saying, okay, let's put our Word documents out in the cloud somewhere, or let's put these spreadsheets or these PowerPoints or something out in the cloud. They're different, right? They're not just files. Even 2D CAD like AutoCAD can get complex when you're managing files. You have XREFs, right? You may have linked spreadsheets for data. And if you get into the 3D parametric CAD, again, like Inventor, by definition, you're going to have lots of different files involved, and those files all have relationships. And if you're missing a file that, say, an assembly or a drawing needs to fully work, you can't work on that assembly, right? And so it's more than just copy the files to some share and work on them, and then you're done. And then aside from just the complexity of the structure, depending on what you are designing, the file sets can get very large. A complete Inventor data set for a large assembly with a lot of complex drawings can easily get into the hundreds of megabytes for just the set of files you need to describe, a crane or a set of bleachers or, a skid with a lot of piping and tanks and equipment on it, right? We can easily get into the hundreds of megabytes of files just for like one part number, for example. So we've got the complexity, we've got the size, and then the way these CAD applications work, again, especially parametric CAD, because you've got all of that data and the file sizes can be so large, this software is optimized to read into memory only what's really necessary for the task at hand. So over the years, they've optimized this software so that you're not loading up, what as compressed might be 300 megs of data. Uncompressed could easily be a gigabyte or two, rather than just load all that up into memory and have done with it, you know, files are compartmentalized and data gets loaded on demand. What that means is you really need a low latency, high bandwidth, and maybe most importantly, stable connection from your CAD application running on your client to wherever the files are stored on disk. You need uh, extremely low latency. And if you look at, use like Procmon or something to see how Inventor, for example, interacts with a file system, it is hundreds and thousands of file operations, as you're working. If you've got any latency between your client computer and where the files are stored, every millisecond of latency adds up to the point where the user just gets frustrated. So even on an internal network, let's say if you've got an older network that's just like 100 megabits, or you've got some, congestion on the network, even on the same local area network, files stored on a share can cause issues with saving and stability. It can cause a little bit of performance issue. If you start to work on CAD files stored on a wide area network, maybe you're getting into the 10s to 30, even 50 milliseconds of latency or more between, again, your computer and where the files are stored, the software very quickly becomes unusable. And then if you start, say, putting the files in some, like in a worst case scenario, I would say if you put it on what is essentially a Windows share that happened to be stored on the cloud somewhere, you can just forget it. It's gonna take you forever to open an assembly. You're gonna end up crashing when you save. It's just gonna be a disaster, right? So just from a technical perspective, moving the files away from either the local computer or a fast local area network, when we're talking about CAD, there are some real challenges to moving CAD data away. And then when you get into the workflow side of it, CAD users are often working collaboratively, meaning, let's say you do put your files in the cloud, and we'll talk more about the possibilities in a minute. If you don't have a good way if that storage solution doesn't give your users a good way to collaboratively work on the same set of files at once, you're going to run into workflow issues. Right? And then if you move these files frequently, let's say, well, we want to keep it all on the cloud, we want to have them work on it locally, so we'll just have them, say, copy work down to their local computer, and then they can work, and then they can copy their stuff back up. That breaks parametric relationships, and so the data really either needs to go where it's going to go and stay there, and then have some relationship aware software mediate some sort of transfer, or the files just need to stay, you need to have a constant low latency connection to them, right? And some of this may not make a lot of sense right now, but when we get into more of some of what the other software can do, I think it might. So with that underlying groundwork, again, the idea, lots of relationships, large file sizes, requirements for low latency, high bandwidth, you might start to see that some more traditional generic cloud storage solutions really are not a good fit. And we see this a lot where companies, especially smaller companies that have maybe just a few CAD users, and especially if those CAD users end up getting spread out, or as if like during the height of the pandemic, where a lot of people were maybe permanently working from home, companies would copy files, say up to Dropbox, for example, and then rely on files to be synced back to the local computer. Well, these solutions like Dropbox or SharePoint, they have no idea how, say, Inventor files work or AutoCAD files work with XREFs. They just treat pretty much every file like a file for the most part. So that causes problems in a couple different ways. If you need to move files around, well, files don't get moved appropriately, things don't get updated. But one of the bigger issues is these solutions usually don't offer the level of control you need over the files. say revision control. You might have some basic versioning, but there's a difference between version and revision when you're talking about editing engineering documents. And the ability to say lock a file for edit so that other people can't modify that file while you're working on it. So often what you end up with is, two different people open the same file on their local system because it's been synced down with Dropbox. They both start to make changes, and whoever's version syncs up last is the one that wins. And you don't have visibility over who's editing what and when. It becomes a real issue, right? And the question I have, what does it say about traditional generic cloud storage solutions in CAD? Well, I think I just answered the question. They're not good, right? You shouldn't be using Dropbox if you use Inventor, in my opinion. You can get by with it if you're careful and if you don't work on the same set of files as somebody else. But it's certainly not ideal, right? Now, that said, all of these challenges aside, there are some real benefits to having the CAD data off-premise, right? A big one is access, right? Depending on the storage solution, the cloud storage solution, or what software you're using, you won't necessarily be dependent upon a VPN. And you won't have to worry about, if you did have to use a VPN, you wouldn't necessarily have to worry about, say, your on-premise, physical location's internet connection. I've worked with a lot of companies over the last couple of years where they have a VPN solution. All of their files are on-premise, and so they have no choice but to go through the company's internet connection, and they're in a rural location, and they don't have access to good connectivity out where they are. And so, yeah, you can work from home, but, it's suboptimal, to put it generously, right? So access can be a huge benefit if your files are somewhere outside your physical location. Security also can be a huge benefit because typically, again, depending on the solution and depending on your local infrastructure, you would have better redundancy and better security than an on-premise network, right? And that really depends on how things get accessed. It depends greatly on the solution you're using, both on-premise and in the cloud. But, again, places like Dropbox or, just more generally like AWS, like Amazon Web Services, they have entire teams of people dedicated to keeping things secure and safe, right? And if you have just one or two IT folks or maybe third-party IT, I'm sure they're paying attention to security, but you've got, limited resources responsible for securing the entire enterprise, right? So security often can be better with the right off-premise storage solution. And then collaboration can be improved as well. If you can somehow safely get the data outside the firewall, it can greatly simplify interaction with vendors and suppliers and customers. You don't have to give VPN information to a customer so that they can then log into your vaults, for example, and look at something. You might be able to just share with them a link that they can go to and see what you want them to see and maybe even comment about it without having to deal with getting through the firewall. Right? So all that's good, right? Off-premise CAD data can be very good if it gets off-premise in the right way. So let's talk about the different ways you could get data off-premise, right? Generic storage, like I talked about, Dropbox and SharePoint. We already talked about that. That's bad, right? They don't understand CAD file relationships. You generally have poor access control. You don't know who's editing a file and when. So collaboration pretty much goes out the window. It's even worse than an on-premise shared network because if nothing else, if someone opens an AutoCAD drawing from your local file share, everyone else who opens it, it's going to be open read-only. At least they'll know somebody's working on it, because there's a locked file sitting in that folder. But something like Dropbox, it's open season on the files, and that I've talked to many companies where that's become an issue. So the generic cloud storage for very limited situations might be okay. Now, the other method, the second method I would say, would be using what is called infrastructure as a service, but with a more traditional on-premise PDM solution. So what I mean by that is you have a server somewhere off-premise. It often would be on a cloud, a cloud service structure infrastructure provider like AWS or Azure or Google, or it could be a physical server or a virtual server sitting in a data center somewhere managed by somebody other than the big three. We've got customers doing that as well. And that is better, right? Because at least you have the dedicated PDM solution, say for your products, say Autodesk Vault for the Autodesk products, so that you've got this sort of control and functionality and feature set, things like rename and copy design and check in and check out. You have all of that functionality at your disposal, but it's off premise, and it gives you more options, I would say. Now, it's not necessarily the best in all situations, because cloud infrastructure, it can get expensive, especially if you end up with lots of storage that needs to be fast, or lots of processing power. And these things typically need to be on 24/7, because you're not sure when someone's going to work necessarily. You don't just turn it off and on all the time. And so you could be paying for a cloud machine to be up for 24 hours a day when it's really used mostly 10 to 12 hours a day, right? And those costs can be variable too, again, depending on the type of service you have. I see there are memes about people getting hit with huge bills from AWS, for example. Now that would usually be in something not like PDM. The cost would be a little bit more stable because you've got a server, you're paying for that server, depending if you're paying for CPU time, it might vary a little bit, but we're not talking about something crazy scalable. So the cost can be variable, but it's usually the higher level of cost, I would say, is the bigger issue with something like cloud PDM, where you're managing it. And that's the other thing is if you're using infrastructure as a service with traditional PDM, like let's say we've got a server in the cloud, we want to put Autodesk Vault on it, you still have to maintain that server, right? You have to maintain the virtual infrastructure. You have to maintain the OS, right? Apply updates and whatnot. You've got to maintain the server, the software on it, the Autodesk Vault server software, and patch that, right? So there still is IT overhead. And that includes securely connecting that remote instance to your users. And so depending on, again, your Vault always has to be behind a firewall. Depending on your VPN, if you put Vault on a server in the cloud, you could still end up going through your company on-premise network anyway, right? And you're just really tacking on even more latency and transfer time. So ideally, if something existed to work well with CAD files in the cloud, you would use software as a service, right? So if the solution supports your CAD application needs, this in my mind would be the best. Software as a service, meaning we pay X amount per month, per year, whatever, for this service, this software that runs wholly in the cloud. Whoever we're buying that from, they pay for the server costs, they deal with security, all that stuff. I just want to be able to say, go to a URL and work with my CAD files in a good way, and then I'll pay you X amount per month or year, and then I don't have to worry at all about the infrastructure, right? you could get away with this with no IT support at all, at least on that end. You always need some sort of IT support for your endpoint security and whatnot. But software as a service ideal would be best. So let's talk about specifically now what Autodesk could provide in this area. And really there are two PDM solutions, meaning like say CAD file and CAD data management solutions that Autodesk can provide. One is Autodesk Vault. There's no software as a service option from Autodesk, right? It has to be deployed. If you're going to do this in the cloud, it would have to be done on cloud infrastructure, right? But we have a lot of customers doing that these days, and it can work very well. And to get around the problem of, well, you need a fast, like low latency, high bandwidth, stable connection to the files on disk, the way Vault works is when you want to work on something, it copies a file to your local computer. It mediates the copy and makes sure you have all the necessary files. When you want to work on something, it checks the file out to you so that other people know you have it checked out and they can't modify what's on the server, right? So Vault handles collaborative work and facilitates remote work. Even if you're just working on a VPN from home, it can make remote work much easier and better. And then with the latest version of Vault Professional, you can even expose your data outside the firewall securely using Vault Gateway. It's a new feature in 2023. So Vault has some great options. And it's a way a lot of our customers are going, putting a Vault server in the cloud somewhere. But you do still have that need to manage the cloud infrastructure, to manage the Vault software, et cetera, right? Now, as of several months ago, Autodesk has a second option now called Upchain, right? And that is software as a service only. There's no on-prem version of it. You couldn't run your own Upchain server. It's a service you would buy from Autodesk. But it is, that what I would think that best option if it meets your needs. Minimal IT needs, it's a fixed cost, it's a known entity, right? And Upchain, it also supports multiple CAD applications outside of Autodesk. So SolidWorks, Creo, NX, I believe, there are several. And so especially if you're working in a mixed CAD environment, this can be a great solution to get one PDM system to manage all of your CAD data. Now, just like Vault, Upchain gives you local access to the CAD data. It also copies the files down to your local computer, so you're working fast and reliably. And then check the files out, right, when you're editing, all that same stuff that Vault does at that basic, file control level. It's just the files are stored in the cloud on an Autodesk server that Autodesk maintains, right, so that you don't have to maintain it. And because you're not maintaining it, because it's designed to be exposed to the internet, you can get to it from anywhere securely. You're relying on Autodesk security, which we'll talk about here in just a second, to secure the data. You don't have to worry about a VPN or managing a server. They turn on your Upchain server and you start using it, right? Now, I think we have a lot of attendees today that might already use something like Autodesk Vault, a lot of Inventor users. As of today, Upchain doesn't currently support every last bit of Inventor functionality. So things like iParts or iAssemblies are a good example of that. Not everybody uses those, but Upchain as of today doesn't support adding files to the system that use that functionality. That said, Autodesk, and from what I've seen, is working extremely quickly at enhancing Upchain to support all of that. And from what I've heard, within the next few months, at some point, you'll be able to use Upchain, I think largely like you could Autodesk Vault today, where just about any Inventor feature you want to use would be supported by Upchain. That's what I've heard. I can't say for sure. We're not Autodesk, so keep that in mind. But any shortcomings in Upchain right now in terms of specific feature support are short term for sure. So let's talk about security now, because that's the other part of this presentation. We talked about usability a bit, and it can be usable if you set things up right. Let's talk about security now. So generally, off-site data, if you do it the right way, can generally be safer, right? And one of the big reasons is because you've got a good separation between your endpoints, meaning your client computers, and the data source. So when we're talking about Vault, for example, or Upchain, I guess both in this case, the way a end user computer talks to the Vault server or Upchain, the way it communicates is different from the way, say, malware, especially one of the biggest worries today, ransomware. The way ransomware typically spreads through a network using what we call server message block, basically like Windows file shares or remote desktop, or like just general peer-to-peer software like Teams or Skype or something. The way the client computer talks to Vault or Upchain is fundamentally different than the way those other things talk. And so let's say you get malware on your network and you get a bunch of stuff encrypted. If your Vault server's in the cloud, or if you're using Upchain, the odds are very good that data is not going to get corrupted or encrypted, right? So that will, nothing else, be one less and one very important less thing to worry about to recover. In addition, the underlying infrastructure, say, especially to AWS or Autodesk servers, Autodesk stuff is generally on AWS anyway, the actual access to those things are extremely tightly controlled. They're in a data center somewhere. They have extreme security, physical security, so it's different than, say, a server you've got sitting down the hall where, say, an internal bad actor could maybe just go, if they know what they're doing, plug a USB drive in and start copying a bunch of data down. You also commonly can get better feedback about who's accessing what in a situation like that, right? And these remote solutions, they have entire teams of people dedicated to security, like I said before. So rather than the one or two generally overstretched resources you might have on site for your IT stuff, they're fixing printers and dealing with end user questions. And oh, by the way, you also have to make sure everything's secure, right? Those poor overworked people, for like Autodesk, they have entire teams of people just dedicated to making sure things stay secure. Right? Now, it is, though, an attack surface that you don't have complete control over. You can't control AWS core security. You can't necessarily control Autodesk security. So that is one thing to worry about. But like I say here, I personally don't make my own door locks, right? I would buy that from a professional because they know what they're doing, and even have it installed by a professional because they know what they're doing. So even though I don't control how that door lock works, I can put my trust in Kwikset and the locksmith who installed it that things are going to stay secure, right? So for the things that the different solutions, specifically, let's say for Vault security in the cloud is really about as secure as you can make it, right? Because you still control the server, you still control the method to which by which people connect to the server. And so again, Vault always has to be behind a firewall. Never expose your Vault to the internet, to the general internet, except through Vault Gateway. Please do not just put your Vault on a cloud server and let anybody connect to it. It's not designed for that. So that means you need a VPN. You've got to make sure that VPN stays secure. VPN is just another attack surface, right? So Vault can definitely be secure in the cloud, and potentially even more secure than on-premise, because you wouldn't have to worry, for example, about your local file store on an on-premise solution getting encrypted with malware by ransomware, because it's all stored on a server that isn't connected directly to your network. So that could be better. But there are still some issues. With something like Upchain, again, software as a service, the only way in and out of that is essentially through Autodesk's authentication network. And so that's as secure as Autodesk can make it. And then, of course, all of that assumes your end users are following good security practices, right? With something like Vault in the cloud or Upchain, some threats can be greatly reduced against, again, like ransomware. But nothing's going to protect from a bad actor who just downloads your whole vaults or downloads entire Upchain projects to their local computer and copies it to USB and walks out the door with it, right? So, security is layers and moving this stuff on premise, off premise, or going to Upchain can remove a very difficult to secure layer from the equation. So let's say you want to move to Upchain, for example, but you're concerned about, is my data going to be safe? Is someone going to be able to get in there and get it? Or is it going to disappear on me, for example? So let's talk just a little bit now about Autodesk security in general, about their cloud services, right? And a great place to review Autodesk's security stance and current situation is called the Trust Center, right? So the Trust Center, autodesk.com/trust. There's a whole wealth of information about security and about how Autodesk approaches security and about how they just approach keeping your data and your information secure and safe, right? So there's a lot here between, their security stance, how they respond to incidents, privacy considerations, compliance. So I distilled a little bit of this down over the next few slides. But if you want more detailed information, there's a lot here, right? And you can get even more on request, right? So Autodesk is extremely open about how they approach security, right? So they've got a very solid framework in place when it comes to security, right? From the very beginning, they build their products with security in mind, right? They make sure that those products are run securely, right? They secure their infrastructure. They make sure and integrate endpoint protection, manage identities and access, right? If you remember, any of you are in IT, you remember the log4j exploit that I think was already the end of last year. It's been a while. Autodesk was all over that very quickly because several of their products involved log4 type stuff, and they were right away with advisories saying, yes, you're good, or we're working on this issue, right? So they are definitely proactive, right? They react quickly when they need to, right? Because 0 days are a thing and all of that, but they are also proactive, so that they keep apprised of security threats and make sure that they're taking appropriate action, right? When incidents do occur, right, they have dedicated incident response to properly manage those incidents and coordinate everything, right? So there is a security advisories page, again, on the Trust Center. So this would be a list of all of the vulnerabilities and advisories that they have. And they do have some specific Autodesk IDs for these, right? And you can see there are quite a few advisories here, some going all the way as far back as 2016, right? And if you look at a specific vulnerability, it'll give you even more details about that in terms of severity, a summary, and then the CVEs related to that and recommendations. So there's just a wealth of knowledge on the Trust Center. If you're concerned about security or how Autodesk approaches security, I can tell you looking at this site alone makes me personally feel much better about recommending an Autodesk product to our customers just because of how seriously I see they take things, right? And to guarantee they're taking all that stuff seriously and appropriately, they do comply with industry standards and regulations. Again, at the Trust Center, they have product by product, which products adhere to which standard organization compliance processes. When it comes to, say, personal data, they've got information about how they comply with various laws, be it, the EU or China or here in the US. the various regional and global legal requirements for managing privacy data, right? And so, again, the Trust Center just has just a ton of information. So if you have any questions about, can we trust, say, Upchain to hold our data? Is someone going to go steal it, or is it going to disappear tomorrow because Autodesk can't keep their servers up? Go to that page. And if you want to see at any given time the status of the services, health.autodesk.com, this would be all of their various services, and if there are any issues, things like scheduled maintenance, etc. It would all be here, right? And so right now it looks like everything's green across the board, but there was an issue, well, except for this one, right? There's service degradation, right? So again, I don't know that they could be any more open when it comes to security and availability. So let's talk just a little bit more in detail about the various PDM/PLM applications Autodesk can provide. Because again, I think we have several attendees today that may already use an Autodesk solution, maybe Autodesk Vault. And I want to make sure we understand where that fits and what options might be available if they wanted to move to something else. So let's talk about the various cloud/on-premise solutions Autodesk has for PDM/PLM. So you may have heard of Fusion 360 Manage. That is a cloud-based PLM only solution as of today, right? It doesn't manage CAD data specifically right now, so it is completely CAD agnostic. It's extremely flexible and configurable, and it's extremely capable right out of the gate. It's got incredibly detailed workflows if you need it. You can use it simply. You can use it in a very advanced form right away if you need, right? Autodesk Vault Professional. This is mostly what I would call PDM, managing the CAD data. It is technically an on-premise solution, what you would call, but that means you could also install it on a cloud server, right? It's just that whether that server is in your server closet down the hall or in a data center in Northern Virginia, hosted by Amazon, you install the software and run it, right? It supports Autodesk CAD software better than any other solution, no question, right? And it has some limited support for, say, SolidWorks and Creo, some other third-party applications. Upchain, which I've mentioned a few times today, is cloud-based PDM and PLM. It manages CAD files, and it manages process. So I would consider PDM is, if you want to put it in very coarse terms, PDM is managing files, PLM is managing data and process. So Upchain does both. It supports several different CAD applications, and it is, I would say, it's somewhat configurable, but also extremely capable out of the box. And it is completely cloud-based, like Fusion 360 Manage. And then just to try to clear up some confusion, if you use Fusion 360, which is the cloud-based CAD application that Autodesk provides, there is something called the Fusion 360 Manage extension. So this is different than Fusion 360 Manage, and it is different from Fusion 360, the CAD application. Fusion 360 Manage, that alone, is cloud-based PLM. Fusion 360 alone is cloud-based modeling and CAD and lots of other stuff. The Fusion 360 Manage extension is used with Fusion 360, the CAD product, to give you better control over release and revision management of the files you're working with in Fusion, the data, I should say, you're working with in Fusion 360, right? So if you hear manage extension versus manage versus Fusion 360, they are technically different things. So just to keep that in mind, right? So, and again, 3 of these things only live in the cloud. 1 of them can live in the cloud, right? But there's some interesting things happening on the Autodesk side, especially when it comes to specifically their cloud-based offerings, because there is a fair amount of overlap in terms of fundamental capability between Upchain and Fusion 360 Manage. Upchain does file management and PLM, meaning bill of materials management and supplier management and change management, right? Fusion 360 Manage does change management, supplier management, BOM management. There's a lot of overlap there. And so what we're hearing from Autodesk, and we have no definitive date or timeline. We have no idea how it's going to wash out. But ultimately, I think what you're going to see, and this is my opinion now, based on my almost 20 years of experience with all of this, my opinion is at some point, you're going to see these two essentially merge into a single product. I don't know how it's going to look. I don't know what it's going to look like or exactly how it's going to work, but eventually there will be one cloud solution, in my opinion, that Autodesk will provide to manage both files and process. And so data, people, and process, all of that stuff would be managed in one solution. Now, part of what makes me think that is, if nothing else, for right now, until early next month, here maybe another week or so, if you were to buy Upchain today, you can not only get it at a discount, but also get access to Fusion 360 Manage. So I think this is the direction things are moving. Eventually, this stuff's going to become sort of squashed together somehow, where your file management can be in the cloud and the data and process can be in the cloud as well. Right? So Fusion 360 Manage, I already know it works really well. It's all cloud-based. You're really just working with data in that case, like metadata, properties, and process, and that works extremely well in a browser, extremely well, in the cloud, because it's little bits of discrete data. So what about the PDM side of it? If this is where things are going, if we're going to be expected, if it's going to be common practice that our files are stored in the cloud and we need to still work on them, say in Inventor, how does that work, and does it work well, right? Well, so far, in my experience, it does work well, right? Now, I'm going to show you Upchain here in just a second, a very basic, just so you can see how it works. But in order to give you some context, the way Upchain works and manages data, there's a differentiation between the raw CAD data, and Upchain is very BOM-centric, I would say. So the raw CAD data you can think of as your CAD BOM or your CBOM. So that's your model, that's everything you happen to draw in the model. When you add it to the system, that becomes what we would call the EBOM, or the engineering BOM. That's where you might slightly restructure things. Typically, you would maybe add components that you didn't draw to the BOM, and that's what would be done inside Upchain. And then eventually that BOM goes downstream and becomes, a manufacturing BOM, a service BOM, an as-built BOM, right? But BOMs are key when you're looking at something like Upchain and Fusion 360 Manage, and that really is the way things are going. And even Vault Professional can be used in that context. Vault Professional can understand a BOM. I think traditionally most of our Vault customers do not use the BOM functionality. We're recommending for people to take a closer look at that, because this is just the way things are going. We've been managing CAD data for a long time. Vault's gotten very good at it. It's really time now to start getting more value out of the data management solution, not just check in and check out of files, but how does this help us transfer a BOM outside of engineering? How does this help us get to a complete engineering BOM? Whether you're using Vault or whether you use Upchain, that really should start being the goal. Not just check in and check out of files, but eventually, how do we communicate outside of engineering effectively? And Upchain is kind of built for that, right? So I'm going to just quickly show you a little bit of Upchain. So Upchain, there are two parts to it, I would say. There's the browser-based interface, and this is what we see here. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this right now, but it is very heavily based on what we would call projects. Projects is just a bucket, let's say. It's where your CAD files would go in a project. Things can be shared across projects. So you might have a project for common components, you might have a project for hardware, etc. And these projects, there's a lot that can go into a project. You can have tasks. You can, obviously, you have your bill of materials. There are business processes like change requests and change orders and investigation requests or incidents, things like that, right? But just getting down to the sheer usability, because this is a concern a lot of people have. If my files are in the cloud, I know when I work at home over VPN to my shared folder, it's awful. I hate it. I can't stand it. I can't work that way. How is Upchain going to be any different? Well, Upchain is different because you are still working, when you're working with your CAD application, you're still working on your local computer. If you notice, I've got this little browser over here on the right. This is the Upchain browser inside Inventor, right? And if I need to create a component, I can just create that component, right? Make my part, I can make my drawing. I'm just going to save this like I normally would. I'm saving this into a work area on my computer, right? This is on my C drive. And if I need to make a drawing, I can make a drawing too. Again, just like you might do all day, every day today, regardless of how you're storing your files. We're just going to keep this real simple in the interest of time. And if I want to add this data to Upchain, much like I would say in Autodesk Vault, for example, I can see here's this part. Upchain doesn't know about it yet. It's not registered. So I'm actually going to create an item for this. Basically, I'm going to make sure its bill of materials information gets transferred into the system, right? So it's going to automatically give it a part number. It's going to find that it has a drawing. It's going to grab the part. It's going to grab the drawing. It's going to give it this number that you see here. All that's configurable. It gives it a preliminary rev. In this case, it's never been released, so it's rev XX right now. So it checked that in. It checked in the drawing, but it also did several other things. And this is completely out of the box. Like literally, this is a brand new Upchain tenant. The first thing I ever did with it was yesterday. In planning for this webcast, I created this project and added a few things in. It's the only thing I've done to this thing. This is exactly how you might start out if you purchased Upchain, right? And so this part that I just checked in, we see the information here. We can see their related documents. The CAD file got added in. The drawing automatically got added in, but it also automatically created for us a PDF of the drawing, right? It just did it. That's just what it does, right? It created an STL file. It created a step file of the model. There's a thumbnail here too. So it just did that, right? Now, for something like an assembly, you could see all of the relationships here. And you can even view these things right inside Upchain in a really nice viewer, like so. And again, all this just sort of happens, right? If you need to do exploded views, this is very similar to the traditional large model viewer that Autodesk provides, right, for their cloud solutions, right? And again, if there are drawings of something, you can see here, two of these things have a drawing. We can see this one doesn't have a drawing yet. Oh, I need to go make a drawing of that. It's just right there at your fingertips. But again, anything where there was a drawing of this, it would be stored here, and I would have a PDF of it, right? Again, this happens all automatically. So if you have limited IT resources and you need to get your data off premise and you really just need kind of basic check in, check out, Upchain can be absolutely fantastic, right? Now, if I need to go work on that assembly, that's not in my work area here. If I want to go open it up, it's not here, right? Well, I can look at my project's BOM. I can see here's the assembly, and I can open it. This gives me the opportunity to download these files to my local computer, say I know I need to get the drawing as well, and I download it, and I can see the progress, right? So if I've got a slow connection and it's a large assembly, at least I know what's going on. And then when it's done, open up the drawing. So just like that, and yes, this is a small assembly, small drawing, but it literally took 3 or 4 seconds to get it down. It might take a minute or two for a larger assembly, but now everything is local and it's fast, just like if I was, because I'm working off my local hard drive, right? And then again, you know, the standard controls, right? It's currently locked. I could check this out for edit, right? And say I want to check out, I know I need to modify that part too. Check it out, gets it checked out to me, shown as locked. Other people can see it. You can work collaboratively, right? So Upchain can be an absolutely fantastic choice if it meets your needs. Now, again, there are some, I would say, very niche limitations to it as of today, which are being resolved by Autodesk as they, you know, develop it. Within the next few months, it should be capable for just about any Inventor workflow you'd want to follow.